Good afternoon, everyone. I see that we have our attendees starting to come in. In the meantime, I'll just introduce myself and introduce the session as we wait for a few more people to come in. But my name is Tessa Dooms. I will be the moderator for the session, where we will be hosting our first session in the lead up to the Africa Drive for Democracy conference that we're excited that we'll be able to host this year as a collective of a few organizations together at the end of November in Johannesburg. So I am part of an organization called the Rivonia Circle, and we are a South African-based organization who will be assisting in the hosting of the Drive for Democracy. And we're excited about this particular convening of organizations, of activists, of politicians, of change makers in Africa. Last year, when I attended the Drive for Democracy conference for the first time, it became very clear to me that there is a definite need for us as African activists, as African change makers, as African leaders, and particularly young people who are interested in governance and democracy, to start having conversations about how democracy has shown up in our societies, in our various countries and our various contexts, how it has impacted on our lives, and what the future of democracy is in the African context. We all are becoming increasingly aware that democracy is facing serious questions and crises in various parts of the world. And Africa is no different in terms of us grappling with the questions of democracy, the questions of how do we get a true governing of the people by the people, the thing that we truly have fought for in the various forms of liberation that Africa has seen from colonialism and slavery has been about a real emancipated population, people who are empowered to govern. And so as we think about how democracy plays itself out around the world today, the question we need to ask ourselves as the people of Africa is, how do we ensure that for generations to come, people in this continent are able to self-govern, are able to govern ourselves, not only through the tools that we can imagine today, but through hopefully new tools that we create well into the future. And I think that the Drive for Democracy is entering a phase of convening where we are able to start having really serious conversations about what the African perspectives on the future of democracy are. We also know that globally, conversations about the future are being centered. The recent UN Summit of the Future gives us a sense and an insight into the fact that the questions about especially the institutions and the values that we hold right now, whether they're fit for the future, is already on the global stage. But it is important for us to have these conversations amongst ourselves as African people, leaders, activists, politicians, business people, etc., so that we do create, ultimately, as the Agenda 2063 vision says, an Africa that we want and an Africa we deserve. And so I'm very excited to be leading in this first conversation that we're having today. There will be 4 of these conversations over the next few weeks, where we will be doing a lead up and a build up to the Drive for Democracy conference at the end of November in Johannesburg. And today's conversation, we start off by looking back and forward in this conversation. We start off by asking questions about the origins of democracy in Africa, the origins of the democratic project in Africa, and then also its various futures. And so very excited to have speakers with us who on a day-to-day basis in various, wearing various hats, from the high walls of academia sometimes, to research, to civil society activism, have applied themselves to these questions. And I think that it's going to be a good provocation for the kinds of conversations we need to have going forward. But often we think about democracy very narrowly in Western terms, even conceptually. And today is a conceptual conversation in many ways. It's a conversation where you think about, as a concept, what does democracy mean for us in an African context? And what are the origins of democracy and what are the futures of democracy as we envision it and conceptualize it? I was speaking to a group of young people a few weeks ago about democracy and talking about the etiology of the word democracy being Greek. And it was only when we were having that conversation and young people were a bit startled by the idea that the word's etiology is Greek, that I realized that we have not owned democracy as a concept enough. We've allowed it to kind of sit outside of ourselves in terms of its philosophical and conceptual meanings. And its origin story seems to be rooted in one place only, which is Europe and the global north. And so I think today's conversation does help us get a step closer, I hope, to being able to locate democracy within the African context. And so very grateful to see so many participants here, to have our speakers here. And so we have with us for this conversation 3 speakers who have joined us. And we're going to keep this incredibly conversational. And so I'm going to ask our speakers to keep their videos on in as far as it's possible in the conversation. And we're going to do this conversation in rounds of questions and discussion. But really, I want us to keep it as conversational as possible, as informal as possible. I don't think there are any graphs or PowerPoint slides in today's conversation. We're really just trying to get each other's thoughts out and then being able to challenge, sharpen each other's thoughts and perspectives. And so in the room with us, we have Ms. Alice Mogwe, we have Dr. I said Titela again, Dr. Tilela Hatane Vilikazi, and then we have Professor Constantine Manden. And they will be taking us through this conversation as our conversation starters. And we'll be moving through the conversation very kind of systematically. For the audience in terms of participation, there are just 2 things or 3 things to note in terms of participation. One is, I should have said this before I did a long monologue coming in, that there is interpretation for this conversation. And so if you go to your bottom icons, you should be able to see either an icon that says English or French already, or look for the an icon that says interpretation, and you'll be able to choose the language in which you would like to hear this conversation. So for anyone who wants to do that now, please do look for the interpretation button. Mine is under more and then interpretation, and you'll be able to choose the language in which you want to hear this conversation. And then also for the purposes of how the flow of the conversation will go, we'll have this conversation in 2 rounds. So I'll ask a question of the speakers, they'll respond. I'll ask a second question of the speakers, they'll respond, and then I'll open up for Q&A. But as we're listening to the conversation, you can also use the Q&A chat bot and just type in questions in the chat box. The speakers will be able to see that, and we'll be able to respond to that when the Q&A happens, or maybe even as they're speaking. And then when we get to the Q&A session, you'll be able to raise your hand, and the administrators will be able to unmute you from their side if there are questions that come in our conversation segments. So that's how we're going to run the day today. I hope this is going to go as smoothly as it's been happening in my head. But yeah, let's get this conversation started. So as I said, we're going to talk about the origins of democracy a little bit, as well as its future. And so we are going to start with questions about the origins of democracy, where we come from. And so I wanted our speakers, maybe in the order of Alice, Telela, and then Constantine, just to talk about whether it's possible to think about democracy not purely as a Western concept, and to answer the question about whether democracy is incompatible with African traditions, African values, African histories, or if, the ways at which we've come to understand democracy as this Greek concept, literally Greek in some senses, Eurocentric concept, Western concept that seems to have been imposed? Are there other ways to think about our relationship as Africa and our historical relationship with the word democracy? I don't know, Alice, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you very, very much, Tessa, and thanks to the organizers of today. I think a disclaimer, I don't have all the answers, okay? So it's a wonderful opportunity to reflect and learn from one another. I think we can start off by saying that the initial framework for what we call modern liberal democracy was created during the Age of Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment. And this has been said by the European Center for Populism Studies, talking about liberal democracy. And we know that it's characterized by elections between multiple distinct political parties, separation of powers into different branches of government, the rule of law in everyday life as part of an open society, a market economy with private property, as well as the equal protection of human rights, civil liberties, and political freedoms for all people. So that's what we're told the characteristics of liberal democracy are. What we need to also remember is the centrality ascribed to the individual in this space, right? And that is based on the cultural heritage of individualism, right? Also, the doctrine of inalienability of rights, in other words, the rights I have, people can't take away, liberty, again, ownership of private property, security, as well as the right to resist oppression. So that's just sort of the context. We also know, however, that democracy is not the exclusive property of the West. And it can be found in different cultures. We have seen this in the Middle East, India, China, and Africa. But we must, however, not over-romanticize our pre-colonial societies. I'll give Botswana as an example. In terms of the khutla, which is a traditional meeting place in the village, women and so-called minority tribes were not permitted to attend khutla meetings, right? Only the men could attend the khutla meetings. This has now changed. So while we're talking about ensuring that we learn about how life was before colonialism, it's important to recognize that was not all perfect, as with any society, but we're trying to identify the essence of our being and what it was that made us African. The question which then arises is whether democracy necessarily, exclusively, refers to Western liberal democracy, with the ideals to which I've referred, or whether democracy should evolve from within a society. But even in our search for understanding democracy on our continent, we've got to recognize that it's not only those of us who are interested in progress who are asking the questions you posed, Tessa, but we've also seen many post-colonial states, independent states, also putting forward the same question, but for self-serving purposes. And here I'd just like to share an example of former President Kamuzu Banda of Malawi. He's reported to have used Christianity, where he argued that, quote unquote, there's no opposition in heaven. God himself does not want opposition. That is why he chased Satan away. So why should Kamuzu have opposition? Therefore, what did we see? Loads of one-party states, right? And so there were no opposition parties, etc. But we should also be aware that as soon as we enter into the space of discussing how do we contextualize democracy within our context, we will also hear these reflections being referred to as being imperfect, being immature, maybe even being what they like to say, illiberal. Even though there hasn't been sufficient analysis done to understand exactly what we're talking about. And this is often done using the Western liberal democracy space. I think, therefore, we really do have a responsibility to learn about our history in order to understand our present, to understand what our values are, because we talked earlier on as well about that, and to understand the challenges and contradictions. So in answer to your question, no, democracy does not belong to the West, right? We had democracy even in our own societies. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think that outlining liberal democracy as a very particular thing is also important. I think we do use democracy as a catch-all. What we actually mean is liberal democracy. I think I had a conversation earlier on social media where somebody was saying, do we need, or does democracy work at all, given its ties to neoliberalism? And I had to remind everyone, neoliberalism is a very recent addition to the idea of democracy. So we have to open ourselves up that democracy is not this final form we see right now, at its base level. So just appreciation for that. Dr. Delela, don't you want to jump in at this point?
Yes, thank you, Tessa, and I will build on what Alice has said, and good afternoon to everyone on the platform. And I concur with the assertions by Alice. And my view is that while democracy as a system is indeed have its origins in ancient Greek, but we must also make the point that it has never been a benevolent or force for good. It claims to be, in my view. So even that very form of democracy had its own problems and weaknesses. If you follow the history of the Greek democracy, for instance, it was meant for slaves, just as Western current democracies, in my view, are for the benefit of the dominant. And why I'm making the point? I'm making the point, whilst the question is it a Western concept, incompatible with African traditional values? And the answer would have been maybe a no. However, even that current form, that form of the liberal democracy has got its own weaknesses. So perhaps it will answer why we're having many challenges around it. So it becomes a misconception, therefore, to assume it is inherently incompatible with African values, as Alice would have alluded to. Many African societies really value the principles of consensus, which democracy seem to build upon. Community participation. So if we argue, for instance, participatory democracy, that has got its really foundational constructs in the African continent, respecting rules ideally, whilst our societies currently are challenged with those. But the point I'm making is African societies have always had fundamental principles of consensus building. Lekgotla, as in the case Alice has mentioned, in the Eastern Cape, Ibunga, of course, exclusive of women, but decisions were taken there in the form of the majority, which is a democratic principle, whether it was called democratic principle or not, but it was always there. Maybe the challenge lies in how in African societies we adapt, given the influence of Western approaches to how democracy should be. Perhaps that's what we should really be focusing on, given the diverse cultural norms and our belief in a communal society based on Ubuntu. Maybe that's why we should locate that debate. Are we adopting as more from a Western approach, or are we saying whilst Africa has had democracy, but have we leaned more dominantly towards that Western approach, and how is that working for us? As the younger generation would ask, how is that working for you? It seems there are challenges. Thank you, Tessa.
We can't hear you, Tessa, you're muted.
Apologies, everyone. I just wanted to ask Dr. Constantine, as you lean into that, there is this idea of democracy as the best of the worst systems. But I think Dr. Delela kind of challenged that for us in asking, is it always for the greater good? Or does it inherently have in it, even as far as its origins, in Greek society, have in it kind of biases, inequalities, and ways that structure society that are not useful for us. So in answering whether or not it's incompatible with Africa, I think also asking just how do we even defend it as the best system? Is that even the conversation we should be having as a starting point?
Thank you so much, Tessa, and I really love everything that Madam Alice Mogwe has just mentioned, but also what Dr. Talela as well has mentioned. So I wanted to make kind of three major points, and I'll try to address, Tessa, this additional point on whether we should perhaps reimagine and really refashion political institutions in Africa to incorporate the diversity that Dr. Talela was talking about in the continent, the indigenous institutions, cultural institutions of Ubuntu, and so on. So let me first begin by saying my first point is really there is increasingly new scholarly work in history and anthropology and political science and economics that basically rewrites the history to be much more reflecting of the truth with respect to understanding the origins of Western democracy. So when we think of the Greek democratic project as the oldest of that manifestation, we know from history that the Greeks went and literally studied in Egypt. In Alexandria, they studied about the Sumerian civilizations. They studied about all the civilizations that the Egyptians had knowledge on, including the Indus civilization, the Yangtze River civilization in China, and so on. And so the first thing that I think, and I'm teaching coincidentally this semester, tomorrow, I'll be in class on a course titled "The Politics of Decolonization." And one of the first things that we try to do in that course is to try and decolonize this idea that Western democracy is inherently Western. So that's, I think, the first thing that I want to kind of situate this discussion by saying even the oldest democracy in the world isn't really a function of Western institutions, indigenous to Western institutions per se. And then the other point that I want to make is this idea of pre-colonial Africa and the influence of long-lasting indigenous institutions. And there I want to push back a little bit against what Madam Mogwe said, and to really be in a bit more of support for Botswana as an important example. And so there's a really lovely piece by Professor Olufemi Taiwo, who's a Nigerian academic. It's in a 2023 piece. It's a lovely piece. And he argues that this idea of calling pre-colonial Africa is a vacuous and impoverished terminology. And he has many examples to explain why that is. One, for instance, how do you consider Egypt, pre-colonial Egypt versus colonial Egypt versus post-colonial? How do you take into consideration Liberia? How do you take into consideration a country like Ethiopia? How do you take into consideration North Africa that was engaging in conquering Southern Europe, that was engaging with, in some cases, destructive political and economic changes to not just those institutions in Africa, but also in the Mediterranean parts of Europe. And so, all these ideas from St. Augustine, who is an African individual, and so on. So, his argument is this idea of making something pre-colonial really centers African history on the colonial. And if we're really serious about decolonizing a lot of these institutions, then we must begin the discussion from a point of view of centering on the African. So the ancient world, the classic world, in the same way that you describe Europe, you should also describe Africa, because you have thousands and thousands of years preceding much interactions between the Europeans and the Africans. And scholars are still debating the extent to which these colonial institutions are more important than the indigenous. And so the example you want to give, for example, with Botswana, so I just want to push back. Madam Mogwe says, well, these institutions that were quite democratic in Botswana, that a lot of scholars have argued mattered for how well Botswana has done politically, economically, and socially, and so on. And Madam Alice Mogwe is right by saying that they didn't include women, they didn't include minorities, but that is true of the United States as well, which is considered the oldest surviving democracy. The Americans gave women the right to vote in 1920, which is about 144 years after their independence. An equivalent amount of time in Botswana would mean that women in Botswana would only be getting the right to vote in the year 2110, because Botswana got its independence in 1966. If you add 144 years, you find that it'll take, even today, Botswanan women would not be able to vote. African Americans were given the right to vote formally by federal legal protection in 1965. That's about 180 plus years after independence. If minorities in Botswana were to be given the same rights to vote in the same timeline, they would be gaining that right to vote in the year 2200, basically. They would be, not having the right to vote today. So the backdrop within which we need to be interrogating this is the backdrop where the current historical record favors the idea that there are no indigenous institutions that matter, that the Americans, the Western institutions were really the more important ones. And so just by these two counterexamples, one, the point that I made about that Western democracy itself owes its origins from the Afro-Asiatic fields, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Berbers, the Moors, the Chinese, and the Indus Valley civilizations as well. And then the second point that I want to kind of reiterate is this idea of pre-colonial Africa and the long-lasting indigenous institutions. I'll try and paste some scholarly links here on the chat, but Benson, Hariri, and Robinson, they have a paper in 2017. Steuben has a paper in 2000. Both of these make arguments and do a serious job of convincing the reader that the democratic institutions in Africa are really a lot of a function of indigenous institutions. So they give the example of Ghana, the Asante, having a very democratic set of institutions that were proto-democratic, that mattered because the Asante were politically influential in Ghana, such that eventually Ghana's trajectory has on average been democratic. There, of course, have been an interruption of coups, but that is quite not uncommon to the European or American stories as well. And then Steuben 2000 makes the same argument for America's democracy, that the American democracy has also been influenced by indigenous Native American institutions that preceded the settler colonialism there as well. And then the third point here is then, if we believe these stories around indigenous institutions mattering for African democracy today, why is Africa on average still not very democratic? Some of these responses Dr. Talela has highlighted, and Madam Mogwe as well, including, for instance, just diversity. The continent is the most diverse continent in the world. In another class that I teach on the politics of genetics, we look at the vast amount of genetic variation within Africa. Africans differ among themselves more than they differ with other groups around the world. That has also mattered with respect to geography and how geography has influenced ethnic diversity. It makes it very, very hard when you're trying to hold together a house when everybody has a different opinion. It's much, much easier, as the American democratic system was built upon, where you had much more consensus. So at independence in 1776 in the United States, the Republic couldn't resolve the issue of slavery, could not resolve the issue of repatriating land to Native Americans. And so they said, listen, let's fight the British Navy, let's fight the mighty British Empire. If we win, we can then resolve some of these issues. They didn't resolve the issue of slavery. It only took about 100 years later, in the 1860s, for them to have a bloody civil war to even come close to resolving the issue of slavery. And then another 100 years to the 1960s to resolve civil rights acts to give African Americans legal guarantees for voting and other civil rights acts. And so even there, the question is to say, well, Botswana gained independence as a modern state in 1966, Tanzania in 1961. South Africa really got multi-party, elections in the 1990s and 1994. And so if you look at the same timescale, given the interruptions that the continent has had, if anything, the amounts of democratic institutions that have survived is a miraculous event. The fact that the Botswanans, the fact that the Ghanaians have managed to allow these indigenous institutions to survive is amazing. And in my own work, I showed that other institutions have survived, other political institutions have survived that matter for religious behavior and belief systems, for example, today. The extent to which Africans were able to, for example, retain some of their indigenous ideas. So Christianity in Botswana looks very, very different from Christianity in Tanzania, precisely because these indigenous political institutions survived. These earlier kings who converted to Christianity much before much European incursion were able to negotiate the extent to which some of those indigenous religious beliefs would disappear. And then let me just finally then answer the point that Tessa asked about, well, should we even be thinking about democracy, liberal democracy, as something to be striving for, or should we try to really build it up from these indigenous ideas within that are indigenous to the continent? And I would say that is a very noble thing to do, and it's very, very difficult to see how that can be done, precisely because the continent has been engaging with Africa, with Europe and Asia as continents for much, much longer than most other continents have. So there isn't really has been this kind of African project or African experiment that can be done in a vacuum, so that you can insulate the Africans as the experiment with democracy and so on. From a theoretical point of view, we know from Kenneth Arrow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote about this Arrow impossibility theorem, that basically says, given a set of assumptions, the most efficient or the most optimal system to aggregate people's preferences in any country that is fair is that is efficient while still being able to provide the objectives of everybody, every voter, so that every voter feels like, yes, my preferences have been heard and they're incorporated into policy, is really a benevolent dictatorship. It's much easier for us to agree as a society in a social contract to say, hey, we're going to nominate Madam Alice Mogwe to be our dictator, because we believe that Madam Mogwe, because of her legal training, her activism, the fact that she's a Botswana individual, so she has experience with indigenous institutions, and so we're going to make her the president of our country, and she's going to take a look at everybody's preferences and try to kind of institute a set of policies to aggregate those preferences. The problem, of course, in practice, even though theoretically a benevolent dictatorship is what you would is more efficient, is that in practice it's you would need to believe that Madam Mogwe will remain benevolent, and the problem is that she may not. Once she has the access to power, she may consolidate that with her faction, and she can continue to rule by negating a lot of the preferences of the masses and only catering to some select elite, for example, and she could rule for a long time. We see this in many countries in our continent. Uganda, for example, is another example where indigenous institutions were not very productive. So the Baganda, for example, were a powerful, continued to be a powerful ethnic group. They weren't very democratic in the way that they selected their king, or the Kabaka, as he's known in the Luganda language. And so when the British came, they really created a set of institutions with the British that set the tone for a lot of the anti-democratic experiences that Ugandans experience today. And so it's not a completely rosy story, but I hope I've been able to address these questions. One, just to reiterate, Western democracy is not a function of just Western indigenous institutions. It was influenced and it really borrowed from African and Asian civilizations. Two, this idea of pre-colonial Africa is really vacuous. And to compare democracy and the universality of suffrage among Africans and other parts of the world, Africans didn't have a choice to not include women. They didn't have a choice to not include minority groups at independence. When Tanzania gained independence on December 9th, 1961, everybody, even people who couldn't read or write, were eligible to vote. That wasn't the case in the US. That wasn't the case in Europe. In Switzerland alone, the women were given the right to vote in our lifetimes in the 1970s, and so on. And then the third is then what explains why Africans are not democratic. There's influences of geography, influences of institutions, both external and internal, that matter. And Haiti, as an example of one of the first independent Black nation, was forced to pay reparations to France because of their success in abolishing slavery. There was an embargo, and Haiti to this day is a country that I believe Africans should easily be able to use its geopolitical influence to help, but we aren't doing enough. And we're not realizing that the reason it's doing so badly is because it's had the French and other neo-colonial institutions, including the Americans, really oppressed them. And then finally, this idea of should we try to build an African indigenous set of institutions and not just think about liberal democracy as it's manifested in the West. And so Kenneth Arrow with the Arrow Impossibility Theorem will tell us, yes, a benevolent dictatorship would be better. And in many ways, Botswana grew out of a benevolent dictatorship with the Seretse Khama royal families. You had these indigenous institutions, but there was still a lot of democratic controls. There was a council and so on. So it wasn't necessarily all full dictatorship, but you could see how efficient it was, that you had a system that the Botswana populations trusted, and then they were able to build really an immense amount of success building that nation. So I'll end there, Tessa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think you've actually started to creep into the second question I was going to ask for this session, and the questions around the future already. And so I wanted Dr. Delela and Memongwe to just have a bite at the cherry around, should we be pursuing democracy at all? Is there a virtue in pursuing democracy as African communities in a time where democracy is in flux and the questions about democracy and its institutions are going to start emerging? Is this what we should be pursuing? And I ask this very earnestly. At the number of times in the last few years, I've heard especially young Black people from around the world get up and ask, why are we defending democracy? Why are we defending democracy? Why are we defending democracy? And so this is a slight variation on the question I thought I was going to ask at this point. But Dr. Delela, maybe for you to jump in with this one, just should we be pursuing democracy at all? And given its journey, the journey that we've walked with it on the continent, given these various influences in it, what is our stake, I guess, in democracy? So I'll ask Dr. Delela to start us, and then Memongwe can jump in.
Thank you. I think in part, Prof has also answered that question, and Alice, and even yourself. It would seem the more straight answer is it is the better of all, the other devilish system around. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. And this is why it's important to do the deconstruction that the panelists were doing, Prof and Alice were doing, to also give context. Because when we talk democracy, people think that is this beautiful thing that has happened to us and that would shape our societies for better. But when we begin to deconstruct the fiction, the myth, and also understand its origins and how it has evolved for better or worse, then I think we'll be able to answer that question, because we'll be engaging from a very more honest approach. So perhaps to answer that question is, well, it's a better devil. Does it work? It seems at times there are moments that it can work, aspects of it that do, but it's a reality of societies, especially in the African context, and also globally, that democracy has got really serious weaknesses. There is no guarantee that it will produce the kind of leader you are necessarily looking for, because you vote as an individual when you go to a booth, for instance, but the outcome is a collective outcome, and you really have no control per se to get the outcome you may desire. And if we're looking at the South African context post 29th May 2024, I was teaching a class last week at Wits about global democracies. I was like, I didn't vote for GNU, but I got a GNU, and it was a joke. People were laughing, but I was trying to simplify the practicalities of democratic processes, that sometimes they've got these layers of nuances that we don't necessarily get the outcome sometimes we're looking for. And if you're looking at the Western Bloc, and I think Prof also alluded to, you look at its own history. The fact of the matter is the collective West, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc., they didn't develop as democracies. They developed as authoritarian states, and with a particular focus on their national interests and national purpose, which were their common feature. And over time, then this system of democracy crept in. Is it perfect when we're looking at states like the United States? We're looking at Europe, United Kingdom? Obviously not. There are challenges. They also don't get the kind of leaders, or at least they tell us, they're not getting the kind of leaders often they are looking for. And if you're looking at the current elections in the United States, that can give you answers to that. So maybe the answer to it is much more complex. But whilst we are making those contestations, we accept the view that it is a common system that seems to be better than others. And if we accept that view, then I'm submitting we should engage, therefore, in honest conversations like we're doing now about its own shortcomings, and also explore alternative models, if there are any, to address societal constraints and challenges within the continent within our continent. But perhaps the challenge we're going to have, democracy has become so popular that having alternatives would really require a radical system, a radical change. And I don't know whether we have the appetite nor the stamina to go that route. And if we don't, how do we then make democratic system within our countries in the continent work for the majority, if not for all, especially given our developmental challenges, issues of poverty, inequality, I mean, all the challenges that our continent is really struggling with. Perhaps that's where we should be focusing and really making our leaders really accountable. We say it all the time, but do we? Do we really make our leaders accountable? And the last point I would make on this, when we look at the South African context, was white South Africa before 1994, as you would know, concerned themselves about promoting white English and Africana economic, cultural, and social interests. They had a project which was not written, but we all knew it was like a poor white problem at the expense of the Black majority. Now, fast forward to 30 years of democracy, you've got different kind of problems. A government supposedly to be of the people, but fails in spectacular ways to deliver for the marginalized. And then the question will arise, how will democracy then work for the wretched of the earth, to quote Fanon's work at this juncture, when the interest of those who are trying to really push for progress has really, it would seem that they are muted. And the ones who are taking us to a different juncture and different route, it would seem that their voices are legitimized. And it would seem to me we're at a crossroads. So the more we engage on the democratic project in our continent, the more we must look at the current contemporary challenges and really what we can do within the continent. Is it our understanding that we can do something that can look like an adapted form of democracy that's aligned, or we can continue as things are they working for us or not? Thank you, Tessa, for that.
Tessa, you're
Tessa?
muted. You're muted.
Oh, we're back to mute. If people have questions that you want to put into the Q&A in the meantime, please do. In about a minute or two after Alice has given an intervention, I'm going to take a few hands. I do see there are some hands. If you do have questions or comments you want to throw into the conversation, please raise your hand or use the Q&A function. Alice?
Thank you very much. Yes, the answer is yes. You're asking whether we should still pursue it. I'd just like to further develop the points which Dr. Telela had raised about the strengths and weaknesses. And of course, we're seeing in Europe right now, the home of liberal democracy, etc., where the weakness of liberal democracy is being shared if one were to look at the responses from the people. The elections are bringing in a lot of populists. We have been seeing a push for freedom of movement, open borders in the past, and now migrants have become the key election issue. We're seeing double standards, which are being put across, even in terms of the application of human rights falling under the liberal democracy, within the liberal democracy framework. So indeed, the strengths and weaknesses. It was just to touch upon that. I'd like to, again, further develop how do we go about it sort of practically. We've had very useful guidance at the academic level, but what does that mean for a young person who's on the call? How do we start it? And I think we have a responsibility practically to try and know our history, learn your history in order to understand the present. And to also identify and understand challenges and possible contradictions. So part of the history, and even though Professor Constantine does not want me to talk about, it's not so much colonialism, but we've got to recognize the nature of the actual colonial state. It was not democratic itself, right? It was centralized, it was authoritarian, and it was definitely non-democratic. One of the things it did was to destroy or sometimes transform our indigenous democratic institutions and values. And there was no replacement of those, disrupted our practices. And oddly enough, we've seen it revived sometimes in the post-colonial state, where we've seen the authoritarianism and the centralization. We've also got to try and find out about how we can become more relevant, how our values can become more relevant. And I can imagine a lot of young people are saying, well, what are these values you keep talking about, right? They have been alluded to by both my colleagues on the panel, but these are often recognized as being collectivism, equity, tolerance, dignity, humanity, the inclusivity, even in diversity, being people or community-centered, consensus-oriented, participatory decision-making. And of course, Dr. Telela also spoke about Ubuntu, which we call Boto in Botswana, which emphasizes humanism based on interdependence, reciprocity, etc., an expression of community values. And also the place of traditional leaders as one group of custodians of culture and cultural values. Recently, on the 20th of September, what was an interesting thing occurred. Our former president, who has been in exile in both South Africa and Swaziland and Eswatini, returned. He was brought back home, accompanied back home by representatives from CONTRALESA, which is the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, together with SANCO, South African National Civics Organization, on the 20th of September. Now, the representatives from CONTRALESA informed the Khutla gathering, I made reference to a Khutla earlier, that they had taken care of him and were bringing back their paramount chief, bringing him back home to them. On the other hand, political attempts by various SADC leaders to engage in this process, ultimately wanting to focus on reconciliation between the current and the former presidents, appear to have failed. And there you see reliance on traditional indigenous institution of traditional leadership. The other one, so one is learning history in order to understand the present, and the second is understanding the challenges and the contradictions. So I got 6 points there. The first one is recognizing that being consensus-based in terms of culture, values, that does present a little bit of a challenge when we think about multi-party democracy and elections, oppositional, different views, and how we marry those two. And sometimes that does produce some challenge. Elite capture of power is a reality, which is alluded to by Professor Constantine. The difference between individuals and community as a basic unit of society, how does that play out in terms of how democracy should roll out? The fact that we're not living in a society which is not engaged with other cultures, other continents, other civilizations. So we're really living in a hybridized context, even when we talk about Africa and African values. And you see that played out in terms of how differently we, in practice, live this private-public divide. Yeah, so often there's an overlap, etc. We've also seen the prioritization in the human rights space of civil and political rights almost above all else. On the one hand, and we are talking about socioeconomic rights, development, and needing to ensure that our people are able to live with dignity. And finally, again, if I'd been made a benevolent dictator, was the loss of trust in politicians because of the lack of accountability. Now, we know that in the past, we know that chiefs could be removed by the people. And yet the image, the story we're told is chiefs are dictators, chiefs don't listen to anybody, etc. And that's why I'm saying, let us also look at that interface between the colonial period and how the colonial state also manipulated some of the institutions which we had. So in summary, yes, I think we should pursue it. It's not perfect, and it has strengths and weaknesses. Thank you.
Sure. So we have two inputs, one on the Q&A, but in Ntsapokazi, I'll have you go first, just to give you a contribution, question, or input, and then I'll read Nick's contribution because it does take us into the next part of the conversation, which is about the future. I know that we have spoken a lot about the past in this first segment, but this was about grappling with origins as we talk about futures, because the next 3 weeks are going to be about the future almost entirely and the solutions almost entirely. Ntsapokazi, I don't know if you are able to speak. Yes? No? Are you unmuted? Have we been able to unmute Ntsapokazi? All right, in the meantime, I'll read Nick's comments. It says, hello team, we seem to be spending a lot of time talking about and analyzing the problem. It is called the smart talk trap. I would like to hear about some suggestions on solutions. One suggestion to focus on the prevention of vote rigging on the continent. Zimbabwe and Mozambique come to mind, and there are some of our leaders that have financial interest in these countries. Nick. Ntsapo? Are you able to unmute?
As Ntsapo is unmuting, I don't know if you mind, Tessa, if I can
Yes.
put in my 2 cents here as well. So I really agree with all my colleagues on the panel, and just to also reiterate, Tessa and everyone, please, there's no need to call me Professor Constantine. Constantine is more than enough. So I tried to answer Nick's question here about then, what are these solutions, and I've given examples. So for instance, the Tanzanian African socialism experiment, Ujamaa, as it's known in Kiswahili and in Tanzania and across the world, it was really one of the first serious attempts to doing just that. The various geopolitical associations of countries across the continent is another attempt at that. If you believe that the African contemporary border states, for example, don't necessarily align with existing ancient political groupings, then the kind of aggregation up, so the East African Community, the Southern African Development Corporation, SADC, ECOWAS, the Economic and West African States Cooperation between West African states in West Africa, and various groupings across the continent, is really an attempt of doing just that, is to say, okay, if we take as given these colonial institutions on how African borders were drawn out and so on and so forth, coming together and saying maybe eventually we might be one country is an attempt to correct that. And so the Ujamaa project in Tanzania, that even if you, for those of you who don't know, you're not allowed to have private ownership of land in Tanzania, for example. This is, even though Ujamaa as a project no longer exists, some of its antecedents, some of its impacts are still felt in Tanzania today. So there are attempts to kind of indigenizing our political institutions, sometimes not necessarily in the direction that we would want, in kind of pro-democratic direction, but there are certainly these examples. Senegal has done an amazing set of reforms, decentralizing a lot of public services that has allowed for the indigenous institutions to become salient again. Namibia is doing a great job of trying to empower and incorporate these minority groups that were very, very important, that in many ways are the indigenous natives of a lot of Southern Africa before the great Bantu migration from the West African corner between Nigeria and Cameroon. That has really been very successful in populating a lot of the countries that we have today. Tanzania today is about 80–90% plus Bantu. Similarly in Kenya, less so in Kenya because you have a lot more Nilotic and other groups as well. But all of this to say that there are solutions across the continent of governments trying to redefine, redesign institutions in ways that incorporate the context in which they operate in. This is happening in West Africa, it's happening in Southern Africa, it's happening in Eastern Africa, it's happening in the North, it's happening across the continent. The problem is, as you know, is that Africa is so vast that it becomes very difficult to tell a unified, simplistic story that Africans are actually moving in the right direction, but we certainly are.
Right. And Nsapakazi, please unmute yourself if you can. You should be able to see the unmute button now. No. All right. So there's a question that's been asked as well that I can see. So while we try and get people to be able to talk in, somebody says Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi had experimented with the idea of self-governance through, I'm going to say this wrong, Jamahiri philosophy. Could it possibly be one of the ways of reinventing participatory governance in Africa? And I want to dovetail this question and just throw it to the participant, to the speakers as well. And so I love the examples that you're making here as well, Constantine, around the socialist experiment, Ujamaa. I honestly think that one of the most understudied leaders is Nyerere, because Nyerere's work is such a practical politics. All of his writing is not philosophical. It's actually very, very practical instructions on trying to create an African socialist experiment as part of the democratic project. And I think, as I said earlier, this separation out of neoliberalism from democracy is a really important part of this conversation, because the assumption that democracy is neoliberal in its nature is wrong. And the Tanzanian socialist experiment is part of that conversation. It's part of how do you socialize and get a social version of democracy. And that's besides the fact that we can talk about social democracies in Scandinavia and different parts of Western Europe as well. So I do think that there are these ways that we can start thinking about how do you define the institutions different at a values level, as a philosophical level, and an outcomes level, because the outcome of a socialist society is different from the outcome of a capitalist society. And both of those things can be democratic in the ways that you roll them out. But I don't know if anyone has any views on how do we use some of these approaches, these philosophical approaches, this example here of the Jamahiri philosophy, some of the practices of, various African traditions. How do we utilize them in a reimagining of democracy and democratic culture from an African perspective? I don't know if there's anyone from the panel. So maybe Alice and Tilela, maybe give you a shot first before I go back to Constantine.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Tessa. I was just listening and enjoying that listening part. And I would just say two things. If we're looking at the kind of work Nyerere, President Nyerere was embarking on, and maybe you can look at also the kind of work, of course, President Gaddafi has been mentioned, and to some extent, perhaps the kind of work that President Nkrumah was doing. For me, what has been missing the past maybe couple of years, decades, is that glue that holds those experiments together within the continent. And what do I mean by that glue? It is the integration part of the continent, because it would have been nice if you're looking at the experiment of President Nyerere that would have sort of Africanized, if you like, the democratic project. But you want that to permeate throughout the continent. Perhaps this is how bodies like the AU then become bodies of interest, and their weaknesses don't seem to help us to take those kind of approaches forward. And I'm trying to be very careful here, but not to suggest work done. But I think we need more of that integration. Thank you, Tessa.
Yeah, the learning from our various context histories and the experiments that are on the go. I didn't know about or think about what's happening in Namibia, or what's happening in Senegal. And I think there's a learning that we need to be doing. Alice?
Thank you. Those were two things. One was the learning. I'm going to be talking more at a practical level, because one can talk about big institutions and what they should be doing. But as you know, I work with civil society organizations, and the work starts in small groups, right? And I think we really do need to try and create intergenerational spaces for mutual learning and sharing. Because, for example, what Constantina shared, what Dr. Telela has shared, there may be some of this information which is not known, right? Unless you're sitting in a university lecture, and you'll get to know about these things. We know that traditionally, values were passed down from one generation to another, using traditional practices. And our practices were viewed as being uncivilized and backward, and pushed aside. So it's really important that we don't lose the essence of learning and protecting our values, which have been lost because the practices which protect the meaning and the reasons, so often described by the younger generation as old-fashioned, have been discarded. Very simple example, greeting. The greeting of one another is really an action which cements that notion of community, right? We are living in a very individualized society. Social media perpetuates a particular narrative without us even being consciously aware of that. So I'm talking at the very basic. If we want to rebuild, we want to reimagine, we want to understand what distinguishes me as African and somebody else as European. What does that mean in the daily lives of our younger generation? And I think that's where we need to start. The second, of course, great work being done by our academics, but African scholarship on issues of concepts of universality. Because so often, whether we're talking about universality relating to democracy, universality relating to human rights, which is the field I work in, how do we consciously give voice to African, not only how we do the research, the methodological approaches, our epistemology, etc. So those are the two broad areas, I'd say, one at the academic level, but the other at a very practical level. And I'd hope that out of this, we may begin to create spaces which can lead to translation into action on the ground and within our communities. Thank you.
And that actually brings me back to a part of Nick's question I don't think we've addressed yet, which is some of the very real kind of practical challenges we're dealing with right now in terms of the leaders that we have, in terms of the institutions as we have right now. So particularly the ways in which young people have lost faith in democracy has been linked to elections and not believing that elections are credible on the continent. I mean, these questions are now being asked in other parts of the world, even, quite starkly. The US January the 6th moment is seared in all our minds as the kind of questioning about electoral outcomes and even the power of elections. But how do we start dealing with these very practical parts of the system and these institutions? How do we start fixing those in a better democracy and in a way that kind of brings young people particularly back and brings everybody back into the conversation about democracy? And then Nick also raised the question about financial interest. And so, I mean, I've alluded a bit to the question about neoliberalism kind of overlapping itself and cementing itself onto democracy. But part of that has been a world order from which there are financial interests that have been gained from these particular versions that we have right now of democratic institutions. There are people who gain very much in terms of democracy as we have it right now. And so maybe if there are just reflections on how do we start to address these very kind of the stark, real, practical things in front of us in a bid to make democracy better at minimum. I do want to ask a question as the last question of the day around imagination, because I'm not seeing any other hands going up and nothing's come up in the chat yet. But if we could just respond first to that question about how do we start to solution for the very kind of practical challenges we have that are disillusioning us when it comes to democracy. So Constantine, and then Dr. Telela, and then Alice.
Yes. Do I go first?
So let's just have Constantine and then yourself, Dr. Telela.
Okay. Yes. So thank you so much, Tessa. So I mean, I wanted to give two examples and then maybe give more concrete suggestions and obviously this issue of financial interest and so on. So one is, as I said, the Ujamaa project in Tanzania, and I spoke only about land, the definition of land ownership, which is quite different in the way different societies and cultures, not just within the continent, but across the world, have dealt with it. And so the way that land is envisioned in Tanzania is really an impact of the Ujamaa policy. But even more importantly, which is something that Tanzanians pride themselves, is that this idea of dealing with this issue of ethnic diversity, this idea of a plethora of different opinions, and how do you straddle all of these differences within a country such as Tanzania, which is one of the most diverse in the world, not just within the continent. And so you can see that politics today in Tanzania is not really contested on the ethnic lines. We still struggle with religious politics, and we still struggle with the politics of gender and how we incorporate women, despite having a woman president today, and so on. And so we're not perfect. We're not anywhere close to being perfect. But at the very least, we've been able to solve this one consistent issue in Africa, which is ethnic politics. And this is truly because of language policy that favored a national indigenous language, bureaucracies assigning people to places that are not of their birth, the way you create the army as an institution, the way you fashion competition within the political districts, and so on. And so there's been a lot that has been studied on Tanzania on this. And then the second example that I think people don't celebrate enough, and this could be something within the sphere of Madam Mogwe in her work in human rights, when you look at the kind of post-conflict situations in Africa, not just in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation, but more importantly in Rwanda, there you see that the indigenous institutions, precisely because the Rwanda-Urundi kingdom was a very powerful kingdom, so powerful enough that, by the way, the Berlin Conference, the infamous Berlin Conference, which is always considered the conference that scrambled Africa, which is actually not true. The conference was only to discuss the borders of Congo, and the Americans wanted to also make sure that the Europeans didn't take Liberia. In that conference, Rwanda was actually drawn within part of Congo. It was only after the borders were presented to the Rwandan kingdom that they obviously had the power to say, no, we're not part of Congo. We are a separate kingdom that has existed for centuries before you guys showed up. And so they were able to lobby that they shouldn't be involved in the Congolese state. But when you had the genocide happened, which has many, many roots in colonialism and so on, the question was, how do you go through all these trials there's so many suspects, there's so many victims, there's so much evidence to go through. If you went through the usual Western style common law British inherited or Belgian inherited institution, it would have taken over 100 years to try all those suspects of who were involved in the genocide. What did the Rwandans do? They relied on their traditional institutions, their indigenous institutions, which they called the Gashasha courts, which was a way to say, okay, we're going to do truth and reconciliation. We're not necessarily going to do it the same way that the South Africans have done it, even though even in the South African case, you had a lot of indigenous institutions incorporated into that process, and we can grapple on whether we are satisfied with that process. And similarly in Rwanda, there's going to be dissatisfactions on how was justice restored, was there fairness, was there restitutive kind of justice that we've achieved. But nevertheless, that was an amazing success story of indigenous institutions working for a practical issue. But it's not just a practical issue; it has very, very deep political implications with respect to which Rwandans have to feel like, was that a fair process? Can we move on beyond that and be satisfied with that process, no matter how incomplete or how imperfect it may be? And then finally, I want to propose a solution. And of course, it wouldn't surprise everybody as an academic that the solution is going to have to do with knowledge. Because, as an academic, I'm a hammer that only sees nails, and nails in this case is knowledge. And the reason I want to say knowledge is important is because I want to kind of push back against this idea on financial interest. The amount of money that's being lost to corruption is minimal compared to the capital outflows from investors. It's minimal compared to the financial havens like Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and so on. There's much more money that Africa is losing through that way than through petty corruption in the continent. And so knowledge is important, because if we know about these things, we can then interrogate and be aware that actually we're being given a red herring every time we're being told to focus on corruption. Every time we're being told to kind of focus on, there's something inherently wrong with Africans, that we must be monkeys in some ways because we've been unable to get rid of corruption. It's just not true that corruption is a big deal as it sounds. And when you ask the Africans themselves, when you look at the Afrobarometer survey data, corruption doesn't typically feature as the top priority for a lot of Africans. They really care about the economic opportunities. They really care about political fairness way more than they necessarily care about corruption as an issue. So I think it's really important in the way that we are, as older generations, allies to the born frees of South Africa, who have really done a radical job of decolonizing in the spirit of Frantz Fanon with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, Fees Must Fall movement, and so on. We really have to do this kind of intergenerational contract where hopefully through death of these older generations, we allow young people to really reimagine and re-engage with indigenous institutions and trying to bring back some of these institutions, like the Gashasha courts, like the Ujamaa kind of ideas, like the deliberative councils in Botswana, in ways that can be much more practical. But I think the boomer generation has to die out first before they allow the younger generations to do that.
I hope they don't have to die physically, because that might take a while. Dr. Tilela, if you could come back on. I know that you've got a battery issue, but in your response, because this might be the last time you respond, I know I've asked about what are some of the practical considerations we need to make, but just to lead on from Constantine, I did want to ask this question about imagination as well. And how do we start to center imagination rather than resistance and the challenges ahead in front of us? So yes, there are these immediate challenges, but there also needs to be the space for imagination. Margaret Atwood says that oppressions, one of the things oppression takes from us is the ability, the time and the space to imagine. And so just what is the role of imagination as well? So I know that I've asked about kind of the concrete stuff, but if you have any views on that, and then Alice will close us off.
Yes, thank you so much. I was just giggling. The older generation must die first. Perhaps I must build from there. Is that a reflection that it's difficult to persuade them, or given the enormity of the challenges within the continent, their presence has really complicated the things? But I got what Prof was saying. Well, the role of imagination can never be underestimated, Tessa and colleagues here. It's very, very important. All societies, the evolution of all societies, at least progressive societies, place at the center of that imagination and reimagination. It must be a continuous project. It cannot end with what our forebears perhaps would have done to take us from the colonial era to where we are, and still really having serious challenges. So this generation has got a responsibility to continuously reimagine democracy. And one of the most important reasons for that is because this democracy, as it continues to evolve within the continent, it is showing us many forms, many challenges of leadership, challenges of governance, challenges of all sorts of things. So it becomes important. I was really motivated when I saw that End SARS movement in Nigeria, which really demonstrated, at least for me where I was seated, the power of a youth that can lobby and advocate and demanding for democratic reforms. And when I saw that, I said to myself, when there's hope within this continent, in other words, Tessa, reimagination can also find deep expressions within activism. So activism is important, and I know that that's the kind of work you do within the civic institutions that you're involved in. And I would like to encourage that, especially that you are in a generation where there are digital platforms. So your civic engagements perhaps could even be much more easier than it was in previous years, because you can engage easier. Everybody's got phones, if not, I mean, almost everyone has got it. So there are a number of things, because if we stop to reimagine what this continent can become, then we might as well not be around. So that process, it's a continuous job, is important. And as a parting shot, I would say, we know this, it's said all the time, Africa has got the highest number of young people, and it will continue be so for the number of years to come. And we can really tap on that. We've got energy here, and our young people in the continent are really, really the key stakeholders, as far as I'm concerned, in shaping the future of the democracies that they would love to see. But that calls for them to be involved. And hence, platforms like the Summit for the Future can help them to share experiences within the continent, because there's also this a view that we can only learn from Western powers, Western democracies, when there is so much that we can learn amongst ourselves, and we try to build and advocate for a more inclusive governance. But I will end by saying, and also in integrated Africa, I still hold that, and I think it's still one of our answers. Sometimes we don't put our pulse on it, but I put my money on it, that some of our answers to our problems can come from that. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lera. Alice, before you give your final parting shot, just to read another comment from Rudy, who says, from Rudy, that says, let's be reminded that democracy is reflected in the day-to-day community collective activity, sports clubs, women's groups, SGBs, etc. And I think that is a very important part of the conversation. We focus a lot on elections, but we don't focus on democracy as a day-to-day activity. And democracy has to be about people governing themselves every day. And so I really appreciate that. And then Nick's final contribution. Thanks, Desan team. I've worked in Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe for short spells in recent years. The common enemy is hunger and poverty. And the suggestion, for no reason at all, please consider a topic on food democracy. Keep up the good work. So Alice, I'll give you the parting shot for today.
Thank you very much. Before the old ones die off, Constantine, I just like to stress again the importance of the intergenerational engagement and learning from one another as part of that reimagining. Learning as part of that reimagining, because we often have limited knowledge about our own indigenous knowledge, about the continuing coloniality, its manifestations, and how sometimes we perpetuate it unconsciously. And thirdly, the need to center our Africanness, reimagining, but center our Africanness. And I'd like to just share very quickly something which I'd written recently as an example. In local civil society meetings with Western funders, with the government of Botswana, and with local, regional, continental, and international civil society organizations, there's always been the unspoken, the assumed. This assumed silently shapes conversations and innuendo. It is the assumed of shared concepts, meanings, and understandings. At this time of what I refer to as historical reckonings, the pluriversality of universals is regularly articulated in the particular contextualized lived experience. There are overlaps of conceptual understandings, but there are also marked differences. In a meeting which our organization had with a Western donor, our staff lapsed into its contextual language of communication, so touching upon what Constantine talked about. This includes addressing one another as uncle or auntie, or you're called after the name of your firstborn child. That is cultural. These denote respect for the individual as a member of the community, as opposed to the position which they may occupy in an organization. The reaction, so we'd forgotten ourselves, right? The reaction of the donor was to immediately ask whether we were all related. There was clear concern we may be running a family organization based on nepotism, right? Because that is not what you do in offices and professional behavior. So the lesson learned was that local civil society needs to know when to use their Tswana context-appropriate language, shaped by local historical, socio-political, and cultural factors, and when to use the Western donor-appropriate language, which reproduces its own historical, socio-political, and cultural nuances, including this coloniality, which we need to remember. We need to know when to craft a language which comprises a combination of both contexts. But we do know that our Tswana context-appropriate language is shaped by our norm concept of Bot. So we need to know ourselves, educate ourselves, have intergenerational engagement as the basic starting point as we reimagine a different continent, as we reimagine contextualized democracy for our people. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Alice. And this also reflects one of the responses that Constantine has given to Rudy in the chat around the role of space and community and language as we start to reform and rethink democracy and reimagine something different. And in fact, it is leaning into culture that will help us do that. And I wanted to say two things in response to that. One was, I went to Thailand a few years ago and was really struck by how much culture played a role in the ways in which what was supposed to be the kind of corporate financial space was built. Even just the buildings that were supposed to be corporate looked really particular and unique. And somebody said, well, when you haven't been colonized, you have the ability to imagine corporate through your own cultural lens without the impediment of the colonizer's view and the expectation from the colonial gaze. And so there is an ability for us to find kind of common ways of thinking about things, but still have our cultural values that kind of push us and practices that push us towards that. But the other thing to say, I think that one of the things that this conversation has highlighted, I think that we need to carry into our future conversations, is the idea that democracy has to become a common practice, not a political electoral practice only. And I think that in the imagination of many people, especially younger generations of people who've experienced democracy in the last 30 to 50 years particularly, that there's this strong focus on elections as the holy grail of democracy. And I think that we have this opportunity as the world discusses the future and discusses the future of these institutions particularly, to start talking about what does democracy look and feel like at our sports club, in our church in the spaces that we inhabit on a day-to-day basis. I think that we have lost that component of democracy. One of the things that happens in our work is we do something called the Democracy Builder. And we have a one-day conversation in township rural communities where we ask people to talk about democracy, but then also to imagine democracy on their own terms, and then to pick an issue that they want to solve for. And what has struck me so many times, we've had about 60 projects that has come out of our Democracy Builder. But out of those 60 projects, 9 of them are farms. And so when you ask people to imagine democracy and how to improve democracy, they come up with a socioeconomic solution to govern themselves out of hunger and poverty. And so I think that part of the conversations we need to have must not limit our imagination to the institutions that are prioritized right now as they are right now, but what we can build from where we are. And so I'm going to have to leave the conversation here because I don't want us to start losing people after the cutoff time. But just to thank our speakers so much for giving us these starting points for the conversation and our conversation starters. We're going to have this kind of format going into the next 4 weeks, and hopefully even more conversational when we see each other in person at the end of November. Because this is the kind of work that we need to do that generates new ideas, that gets us thinking about new conversations and our joint voice as Africans as we head into new conversations. Just to flag that every Monday at this time, we'll be having these conversations for the next 3 weeks. Next week's conversation is about going beyond elections, and it actually segues really beautifully from where we ended now, where we talk about democracy, dignity, and inclusive livelihoods. We will be having a conversation as well in the future about digital colonialism and democracy. And then the last conversation will be about financial resilience and how we build democracy movements in financially constrained and managed spaces. So those are the kinds of conversations we're going to be having on this platform for the next few weeks. I hope next week we get a lot more engagement from participants ready to put in their comments. But thank you to those who did, and really just appreciating the space once again. I think in light of different conversations that are happening, we know about the Future of the World Summit and the things that will come from that, the World Democracy Forum that many of us will be attending. Just the emphasis on needing Africa-centered spaces for these conversations could not be more pressing. So I really encourage us to continue this conversation here, continue it, and grow it into the spaces in our organizations, our countries, on social media and the like, so that we are not led by the nose as we have the opportunity to rethink democracy in the world, but that Africa has the ability to lead because we've taken the time to think about it. So again, just to appreciate everybody on the call, appreciate the team that has put this together, and invite everybody back next week, Monday. We will have similar and more specific conversations on the future of democracy. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tessa. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.
As people are heading out, there's just one more comment. In Senegal, we try to reimagine our democracy by inspiring our leaders, like Soloyame Bal, who did a revolution in 1776 before the French, which occurred in 1789. So nice parting shot there. But thank you, everyone who's been part of this conversation.
Thank you, Tessa.